Hey listeners, this is Rebecca. I have an online group coming up I wanted to let you know about. Starting September 26th, I'll be co-hosting a special book journey through The Wild Edge of Sorrow with Willow Maley. Together, we'll dive deep into Frances Weller's powerful exploration of grief as soul activism. You can go to RebeccaLuttrell.com to register today. I hope to see you there. Hello, and welcome to All the Grief, a regular podcast for all those who have been touched by grief. We are your hosts. I am Rebecca Luttrell.
And I am Andrea Giron Mathern. We are two friends, a therapist, and a social scientist, both highly sensitive, fellow grievers, here to share our hearts as we talk about all the grief. Good morning, Rebecca.
Good morning, Andrea.
How is your heart today?
My heart is exhausted. I've been struggling with illness. It feels like body stuff is just up. I had an allergic reaction on my face a week ago, and then a day later had a cough that I developed, and the cough part feels hard because now all the muscles around my ribcage are like stressed from coughing so much. And yeah, it's like you kind of take for granted feeling well when you feel well, because when you feel bad, you just long for it. So my heart is really just longing for wellness. And yeah, I hope that is happening soon. So
me too. I've heard it in your voice and different voice notes, and it's just cracks my heart open. It just breaks my heart. I can hear how much you're struggling and you're aching. So yes, I hope you get some relief very, very soon.
Thank you. Yeah. How's your heart today?
My heart, feels a little bruised. It's been a rough week. Gosh, it's difficult when you lose a parent to kind of have this new relationship with the existing parent. And it's just been a really hard week with my mom. Although she was with us up at the cabin, we got to see you in the mountains, which was really lovely. And I love having her around. I wish she felt comfortable from her side spending even more time with us, because I just think it's better for everyone. I was actually reading this research article about multi-generational households and how each generation actually lives longer when you live in a multi-generational household. And I just think there's something so beautiful. And I see her aliveness. I mean, it's very hard not to be sort of alive around 2 6-year-olds, but particularly a grandmother's love for them. And they really love being around her. And so it just, it's been a hard week. I'm hoping for an easier one, but who knows what we'll get.
You're right.
Well, I'm excited. We have on today author Annie Sklaver Orenstein, and she wrote a book which came out at the end of May of this year called Always a Sibling, The Forgotten Mourner's Guide to Grief. So Annie is a qualitative researcher, so we have that in common. I loved her approach throughout this book, being a qualitative researcher myself. She's an oral historian and storyteller. She spent over a decade collecting stories from people around the world. Her work has been featured on NBC Nightly News, Comedy Central, Huffington Post, Politico, Time, and Motherly. In 2020, she was driven by the desire to share her stories beyond the walls of corporate America, and Annie founded Dispatch from Daybreak, a collection of letters written by women to their earlier selves. She lives in Connecticut with her husband, her children, dog, and she has chickens. I used to be a chicken owner too. So I'm so excited to welcome to the podcast, Annie.
Thank you so much. I'm so happy to be here.
Well, Annie, we'd love to check in with you. How is your heart this morning?
My heart is good. My heart feels very full with a little hole in it. We have a lot of really exciting things going on in our family. Actually, after this interview, I'm going to a closing and we're buying a new house. And
that is exciting.
Really a dream come true. We'll have more space, but we get to stay in our neighborhood, and we love our neighborhood so much. I mean, we're literally buying the house is 2 houses up from ours. I'm so excited. I also have a 6-year-old and a 9-year-old, and they have been sharing a room. They will each get their own rooms, which is very exciting for all of us. And everyone is really excited, but it has that little, with grief, whenever there's a high, there's that little bittersweet feeling of, I can't text the person that I want to text. I can't call the person I want to call. And we've been having all of these wonderful conversations and dreams of like, oh, once we're in, we're going to have people over, it's a bigger space. And you can't help but think we'll have almost everyone over.
Yeah.
Right. The whole family won't be there. Yeah. And so I think there's always that little aftershock, which it wasn't a piece of grief that I knew. I don't think I'd really heard people talk about it, or I didn't anticipate it. And so in the beginning, that aftershock always caught me by surprise. And now I know it's coming. I can anticipate it, and I think we are approaching the 15-year anniversary of my brother's death. Yeah. And so that we're moving like 3 days before. So I think that's also looming over, but I'm trying to lean into the excitement while also kind of expecting and making some space for that little aftershock.
Yeah, that's beautiful. I'm so glad that you shared that. And I think it's also in your book, the anticipation, this date is coming, and the ways in which you talk about these boundaries that you set around your birthday or around the sort of marking of his death. And so I just think it's such a good thing to share with other grievers that it is totally normal. It's something that we all experience. And I wonder why we don't hear about it quite as much. I have to wonder if it's just like societal pressure of there becomes this sort of point at which you're supposed to stop talking about missing this person. So we just hold it inside as we have this sort of joyful moment, or even silly things. Like I remember when our city park golf course, which had been under construction forever, finally opened. And I remember I was running by it and I remember, oh my gosh, I got to tell my dad. And I just crumbled during my run. Like, oh, I don't get to call him. It's an odd thing to share with somebody, because unless they know that feeling, it probably is like, wow, you still have bouts where you just start crying all of a sudden over that. So I'm so glad that you do share that. So I'd love to sort of open, I know you kind of dove into one part that you share in the book, but I would love to talk about just, you wrote here the sort of whatever they call them in books, there's the title, and then the Forgotten Mourner's Guide to Grief. Can you talk to us a little bit about, obviously that sort of in it states its purpose, but why you feel like siblings are the forgotten mourners?
Yeah, I had felt it after my brother's death. All of the focus goes to the parents, to the widow or partner, if there is one, or children, if there are children. And the siblings are kind of on the outside. We're often not asked how we're doing, but people are very quick to ask us how our parents are doing. And so there are all of these tiny kind of micro things that diminish your grief over time and make you feel like, I guess I'm not supposed to be grieving, and you kind of feel it over time. And so I knew that feeling. And in the interviews I did for the book, people were reiterating that feeling. So I knew I wasn't alone. But as I was really leaning into the academic literature on sibling loss, one thing that surprised me was that in the grief literature and studies, siblings are referred to as the forgotten mourners. It's a known dynamic.
Yeah.
And there aren't a ton of studies on sibling loss, but pretty consistently they refer to siblings as the forgotten mourners or the forgotten grievers. And at first it really kind of infuriated me, because I was like, wait, we know this? This is a thing with a name and a label, and like, we're not doing anything about it. All of these studies kind of wrap up with more research should be done. There isn't enough known, right? But what we do know is they're forgotten and their grief is diminished. And so I really wanted to, for me, knowing that that kind of label existed was helpful, because it wasn't going to change what my experience was, but at least I knew I wasn't alone. At least I knew this was not about me. This was a larger societal dynamic in the way that we're handling grief. This isn't something that I should take personally.
Sure.
And so I wanted to highlight that for others. And I wanted people, hopefully, to immediately identify with that and to see that and say, that's what I felt like, speaks to me. And so they would maybe pick up the book and flip through and read a few pages, but I think that label, it was a little too on the nose when I first read it, but it really validated a lot of what I was feeling and also made it a little less personal.
Sure. I imagine it's a little bit being gaslit, where you're just like having all of these experiences and like, wait, I feel like I should be honored really differently or held really differently around this loss. And then you see this and you're like, oh, see, I should have been.
Yes. And it's these little things like people, they find out what happens or maybe they know what happened and they say, how are your parents doing?
Yeah.
Right.
I think it's lovely that people want to ask how my parents are doing. I have no concerns about that. The problem is that they don't ask how you're doing.
Yeah.
They only ask how your parents are doing.
Yeah.
And my thing is like, you can ask how my parents are doing, but also ask how I'm doing. Because when you don't, there's this feeling of like, well, then I guess I'm supposed to be fine.
Totally.
Mm-hmm.
I think gaslighting is a great word for it. I think I gaslit myself a lot in the beginning. I tell this story in the book, but I went looking for a book on grief and I went to this huge bookstore and there was nothing for siblings. There were books on grieving every other relationship, pets, parents, spouses, children, and there was nothing on siblings. And so I walked out of that bookstore thinking, I guess I'm supposed to be fine because publishing is a huge industry. And so if they don't think there's a market, I had a very like business brain about it of like, if they don't think there's a market for a book on sibling grief, if the publishing industry isn't putting this out, then I guess I'm supposed to be fine. And that's really how I took it. And that's why on the cover of the book, that's why sibling is so large and in bright colors, because I wanted it to jump off the shelf of like, siblings, this is for you.
I love it.
But the gaslighting, it was coming from everywhere.
Yeah.
Especially early on.
Yeah. That makes so much sense. I can imagine sitting there and being like, looking at all the books and just saying to yourself, okay, so it is just me. I am the only one who feels this way. So I think it's so beautiful that you found a way through that, through, your own skill set and process of being a qualitative researcher and wanting to explore this relationship, this really unique relationship. Right at the beginning of the book, you were talking to Dr. McHale, and she talks about what is unique about being a sibling. And both Rebecca and I are siblings. So I'm sure this touched her heart in the same way because I have not lost a sibling. And I can imagine. Just the imagining of it swallows me whole. And so what she said to you was that siblings share this unique understanding of their interior family. And so that no one knows you in the same way that a sibling does. And if you just think about, you share a lot in the book about conversations that you had with your brother and those kind of things. And I thought about secret trouble my siblings and I got into or got each other out of, that just our parents never knew. It's just like these secret bonds that we had, or the way that we navigated if my parents were in conflict, how we supported each other. You just almost have like a subworld that's just you and your siblings.
One of the interesting things that came from her work that I learned was that siblings in childhood spend more time together than they do with their parent.
Yeah.
Right. The other one was more people grow up with siblings than with fathers.
Yeah.
The spending time together piece, at first I was like, no, there's no way. But then I think about it and I look at my own kids. Today after school, they're going to be with the sitter and I'm going to be at work and they're going to be together. And at night, after we put them to bed and we leave, they hang out. They absolutely spend more time together than they do with me. I mean, last year they were at the same school and they would sit together on the bus. And even if they didn't, even if they weren't getting along, they were riding the same school bus, right? They knew that same kind of internal dynamic that I did not have a view into. And so they understand the same kinds of things. And I think that perspective really resonated with me. It was important for me to highlight that this is kind of agnostic of whether or not you had a good relationship with your sibling.
Right.
Because maybe you spent your entire childhood fighting with your sibling. That doesn't mean you didn't spend more time with them than you did with their parents.
Yeah.
And the fact that you didn't get along with your sibling probably significantly impacted your identity and personality development during those formative years. And it's certainly going to impact your relationships as you get older. And so I think there's also this feeling like another way that people will often kind of inadvertently diminish sibling grief is that if they find out your sibling dies, the first thing they'll ask is, were you close? Like that's a qualifier. If I say yes, then I'm allowed to grieve. But if I say no, I'm not allowed to grieve. But that's not how grief works. That's not how relationships work, right? You could have had a terrible relationship with your sibling and them dying can still be extremely traumatizing, and you still grieve. Maybe you even grieve more because it brings up all of this trauma, or you're grieving any hope of a positive relationship in the future. There's still a lot that you've lost. There's a weird kind of judgment that's put on it when people say, were you close? Of, are you allowed to grieve?
Yeah. And I loved how you really, really covered that breadth of relationship. There was never, I'm grieving like this because I was so close to my brother and we're such a close family. Like you never felt that in reading the book. It was so open to any kind of sibling relationship and any manner of death. You really went deep into talking about all these ways in which we create a hierarchy of worthy grief, which we've talked about. We had someone on and we talked about estrangement grief. You may not be close to your parent, but you're still grieving something within that hope, that aspiration that things could change, that things could be repaired or healed. And we spoke with a widower and a widow who said, depending on how your partner dies, depends on the empathy awarded to you for the level of grief that you're sort of allowed to experience and the way in which people can hold it for you. So I just thought it was so beautiful that you explored contentious relationships, estranged relationships. We'll get into the rest of it, but I just wanted to acknowledge that you really opened that up for readers. And so siblings that have any level of relationship have a place in this book. And going back to that piece around how much time they spend together, my boys are twins, and people oftentimes remark how well they get along. And I don't think all twins get along or anything like that. But I often think, I'm like, they have shared everything from inception, they have shared space in my uterus. Like these boys don't know anything besides sharing or anything besides having that being next to them. And so, you can't help but as a mother, and you became a mother, you write about that in the book. After the loss of your brother, you became a mother, and the ways that plays out because you know what it was like to lose a sibling.
I really wanted to talk to a twin who had lost their twin because it just struck me as something that must be a unique relationship, and it must be a unique loss. I didn't feel like I could cover all of these sibling dynamics if I didn't talk to someone who was a twin. And it was really interesting because I would hear things like, we weren't close. If he wasn't my brother, we would not have been friends. And when he died, I felt like someone had cut off my legs and there's a piece of my body that was missing. And the two statements that almost seem like they can't be connected, but make total sense in the context of a sibling relationship.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
And I appreciate the way that you named this piece around the things that people say, the qualifiers, the things in the stories that we create around what we hear. So like you're saying, you walk into a bookstore, there's not a book on siblings, must be something with me, like how we'll turn things into self-aggression that are kind of sometimes just so inappropriate or poorly stated on the part of someone else. And I think it happens in so many grief situations. So how many siblings do you have? And not knowing how to answer that. And I actually love when you were talking about, I believe it was Jason Schwartzman who asked you, and Sam, and you were like, and he gave an answer, and I'm not going to tell you what he said, that it's not about having the just right answer. It's just grappling sometimes with, these are impossible questions to know how to answer. How many children do you have? Are you married? And the ways tense changes, present tense and past tense, and all these little sub griefs that we experience that are kind of just in our culture, these ways that we don't have a narrative. We don't even have a name for losing a sibling like you named. Like we call widow or orphan, but what is it when you've lost a sibling?
Yeah. And I think I mentioned this before, but that ability to demonstrate like setting those boundaries and that you get to be in control of that. It reminds me of Megan Devine's book where in it, she says something to the level of like, not everybody deserves your grief or to hold that. And for me, it was that. It's like there are moments where I can absolutely handle the uncomfortableness or the possible uncomfortableness on the other side of it when I talk about a loved one's death. And there are times when I can't, or just like your energy. And I'm like, I don't know, I may be being judgy and making assumptions here, but I'm going to trust my gut and not tell you. And so I think like you gave people permission to say whatever they want to say whatever they wanted to say in that moment, and that no one gets to hold them accountable or judge them about it. It's what they can do in that moment. The boundary setting in this book is beautiful.
Thank you. It took me a very long time to learn to set any boundaries at all. And then once I did, I was like, oh, this is amazing. I love this. I wish I had done this earlier. And honestly, I was really inspired by a lot of the people that I spoke to for the book and interviewed for the book. You know, there was someone I read about who was telling me that her mom was constantly kind of calling her and wanting to talk about it. And when she was at work, when she was trying to deal with her kids, she kind of didn't give in to it. And I was like, so what did you say? Very tactically, how did you get out of that situation? Because her and her mother still have a good relationship. And she said, well, I would just say, I can't take on your grief right now.
Yeah. I know. I read that sentence and I was like, highlight. Wow.
I was like, you can say that? Like, I didn't know that was an option, you know? And so when I would hear those things from people, that's like the interviews just were so incredible for the book, because I would hear that and like, yeah, on my notes, I'm highlighting it. And I was like, that has to live in the book. Yeah. Because sometimes it can be that simple. And you can say, I can't take on your grief right now. And having that line in your back pocket, I can't even imagine the stress and kind of anxiety that would have been alleviated for me in those first few years if I just had that line in my back pocket. Right. But I didn't even know how to try to set a boundary like that in a respectful way. Like I didn't know. Yeah. I was in my mid-20s. Sure. Mid-20s people pleaser. It was a disaster. And so I wouldn't have known how to kind of respectfully and lovingly set that boundary. Yeah. And so whenever I would hear lines like that, I was like, this has to go in the book because I want to remember it.
Yeah, it was really, I remember that story too and highlighted it. I'm so glad that you recognize that and put them in, because I think it's like this double way. You relate to that human story, and then you walk away with this really explicit tool. I can use those words to set my own boundaries. So it was really beautiful. It also, in thinking about the specificity and the uniqueness of a sibling loss, it reminded me of a moment at my dad's funeral. And it was really small because he passed during COVID and there could only be like 6 people in the chapel at a time. And my godfather came in. My dad was the oldest of 8. So it went 4 boys and then 4 girls. And it was his next youngest brother who was very, very close with. He was close with all of them, but very close with this brother who was also my godfather. And so they walked in and he came to hug me. And I remember like this desire to just cling to him. And I remember being really freaked out because he had like the same arms and hands as my dad. And then I remember him saying like, okay, Hita, I have to get up the courage to go say goodbye to my brother. And I realized, oh God, he's here in multiple capacities. Like he's here as my godfather, but he's here having lost his older brother that he shared 70 years with. And it just hit me like, oh my God, he lost something I'll never understand and I'll never know. He lost these things that I knew, like stories and myths about them, right? They served together in the Navy and lived in Hawaii, you know, and like they went to college together and were roommates and opened up like a bait and tackle shop. We knew these myths, but I just like had this moment as he was walking up to say goodbye to my dad of there's 70 years of stories I have no idea about. And so as I was reading, I really remembered that moment and thinking there's more pressure on him because he's there as my grown-up, as one of my grown-ups, you know, even though I was like in my late 30s, and he's there as a sibling who lost his brother who was like, one of his best friends. So it brought that up really profoundly for me.
It's a beautiful story.
You talk about also this sort of idea of the dreaded shoulds and this unique combination, particularly for siblings, around love, hate, unspoken connections, but all these different things that can really cause like guilt and regret to flourish. And I'm just curious sort of why I know you, along with other researchers, found this to be true, but that this guilt over the loss of your sibling is particularly unique in a sibling relationship.
I think a lot of times, because we're the closest, we are often kind of the closest peer. Mm-hmm. There is almost an artificial feeling of power or control over the person's actions. I mean, you think about it with your kids. How many times are my kids trying to boss the other one around or telling the other one what to do or being the parent, right? Trying to be the parent. And like, they really think it will work, right? Like they really think it's the right thing to do. And I think we feel a lot of ownership over our siblings, and everything that they do. And so it's really easy to have regrets or feel mistakes because you feel like you should have been able to help them. You should have, I'm trying not to use the word control because it's not control, but how many times my parents would be like, can you go talk to him and tell him to do blah, 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 right? Or like,
sure.
My brother definitely, when I was in high school, every time I got in a fight with my mom, I would get a phone call from my brother.
Oh, yeah.
Right? And so you feel like you can do those things. You feel like you have more power than really you do. You feel like, well, I should have been able to fix this. I should have been able to help. I should have been able to do all of these things. And I think depending on the life stage that you're in as adults, it's very easy to feel like I didn't call them enough. I didn't do all of these things, right? And as kids, it's we got in a fight or we did this or we did that. And just the nature of the sibling relationship, the roller coaster of a sibling relationship, you go from screaming at each other to them being your best friend in a matter of minutes. And so when a relationship is that rocky or, when there's so many arguments and all of that is so natural for the sibling relationship, it's really easy to find something to regret or feel guilty about. And then on top of that, there's this feeling of, well, I knew them better than anyone else. I should have known that they were struggling with this thing. And so I think it's kind of just a perfect storm.
Yeah.
And the other piece of it is it should have been me, which I found especially acute when there was a genetic illness involved. Really any kind of illness, but especially a genetic illness. I talked to folks who lost siblings from lupus, and it was one sibling got it, one sibling did it. It's Russian roulette.
Yeah.
It should have been me, but also it could have been me.
Right.
Yeah.
If there's an accident, if there's like an illness like that. And so I think that's like a worm that can really get in your head and impact your own sense of mortality, but also this feeling of regret and of remorse or, whatever you want to call it. But it can be very acute. And it also, obviously can be impacted a lot by the cause of death.
Yeah.
Well, and I love that you named these experiences because so many people walk with the shoulds. They carry like a shame with that, and then they don't want to talk about it. So we don't bring it to the light. We don't bring it to therapy, whatever it is. It's like that truth. I should have done this. And kind of going back to when you were talking about, it's sort of the illusion of what you could have done or should have done. And this idea, even in I can't remember exactly how you framed it, but it kind of struck me, this piece around what was the last interaction I had and the way that you were carrying, did he know I had this present for him? Or there were all these pieces and we carry so much regret. And I remember that experience when my dad died where I was telling my brother, like, God, the last conversation I had with him, I was so irritated with him. And I was just short with him. I wanted to get off the phone. And then there was another opportunity for me to talk to him before he died suddenly. So it wasn't like I knew that was going to happen. and I didn't want to talk to him. I could hear him in the background and I chose not to talk to him. And I was like, I feel so heavy that that's how our relationship ended. And my brother said to me, no one conversation is any more significant than any other conversation. And it was such a relief of that burden and shame that I was carrying about wanting to get it right at the end. So I appreciated you naming that. Look at this whole life. Remember all of it, that it was not just the hard moment, or it was not just the piece of could have or would have. And I imagine that took time for you to get to that place too.
Yeah. And I think something in your story that I want to call out is you got to that place of kind of peace and acceptance with it because you talked about it with someone and you had that conversation and your brother was able to reframe it for you. And I think that's so important because it's very easy to never tell anyone about any of our regrets or shoulds because you're ashamed of them. You don't want to admit that you didn't talk to him when you could have.
Yeah.
But if you hadn't told your brother, then you wouldn't have gotten that perspective on it. And I think one of the things that I experienced with the shoulds was I tried really hard to convince my brother not to go and to get out of his deployment. Ethics be damned. Just get out of the deployment and just don't go. And I held on for a lot of years to this feeling like I should have done more to convince him to stay. And when I was writing the book, so over 10 years after he died, when I was working on this chapter, I asked my brother Sam if he had that same regret because I knew Sam also tried to talk him out of it. And Sam was like almost confused by the question because he was like, none of us were ever going to be able to talk him out of it. He said, I wouldn't have gone. I know that. You could have talked me out of it. He was always going to go. And he was like, I tried. It was very clear that none of us were going to be able to talk him out of it. And he started talking about like the hero's journey. And I think if I had had that conversation 10 years earlier, my God, the amount of weight that could have been lifted off of my chest. But I didn't. I didn't say anything to anyone. And I brought it up to my mom after this conversation. And my mom said she carried the same guilt I did and that my dad told her the same thing that Sam told me. You know, and I'm sitting there like, we should have all been talking about this whole time. And it just was really illuminating that Sam was just, you know, he was so quick to be like, no, we don't have that power over each other. You know, no one could have done that. And that was very liberating for me.
Yeah. I love that it's liberating because I think when I read it, there's this part in the shoulds chapter, which I also love, where you say it's like you realize the limitations of your own influence over your sibling. And there was like a little bit of sadness in it, like Superman around kryptonite, where you suddenly realize, oh, I'm not as powerful as I thought I was. That could be both sort of sad and liberating at the same time, because I think about any kind of loss where there was something that felt preventable, that felt like I could feel this coming, or there was just a high possibility for a really tragic outcome. And I feel like sometimes part of wading through that is like carrying this blame becomes part of the cross that we bear in grief. And so I really love hearing how it can be so liberating to know this power of free will, like people are going to choose what they're going to choose. I feel like it's like this mantra I have. I'm just like, adults are going to adult.
Yes.
Like, and I just need to like.
They're not necessarily going to adult well.
Exactly.
But they're going to.
But turns out they're going to do it their own way. And so letting that go and that grief can be sad, but it doesn't necessarily have to carry a responsibility to it.
Yes.
I think is a really beautiful way to look at it.
I think it kind of goes along with what we were talking about before around this feeling of owning other people's grief. You can just say, I can't take on your grief, right? And you don't own the grief. And I think it's kind of the same thing with the guilt, is that you can just let it go. It's extremely difficult and like, It's not an easy thing to do, but it's not something that you need to own if you can find a way to let go of it.
Yeah. I also appreciated the piece around children in grief. As a therapist, and I work as a play therapist for a lot of years, I am always fascinated by people's idea that children are resilient because they're not showing the emotion of what they're feeling, and they're not considering the whole world constructed inside of this child of like, well, my mom's already upset that she lost my brother. I can't possibly make her life worse by having needs, you know, whatever's happening. So this feeling of like, well, they seem fine. It's heartbreaking. And I really appreciated the inclusion of that in your book, because I think people need to start looking at the way we view children, and especially sibling loss, and the ways that you were saying there's the experience they have as a child, and then there's reprocessing it as your 30 or 40-year-old self. Like, I didn't get a chance to grieve. That felt really important.
There was a tweet, I think, years ago that I saw that was something like, if kids are so resilient, then why are we all in therapy unpacking our childhood? And I was like, oh, shit. Like, as a parent, I was like, this, okay. And I think it's true. There was this study that I referenced that I want to say it was PTSD. I can't pull it up fast enough, where they surveyed parents about their kids, and then they had the kids take the same kind of PTSD assessment. And it was wildly off. The parents were not recognizing it in their child.
Yeah.
I'm not putting the blame on the parents. It's not that the parents were blind to it. It's often that the children were putting on an act in front of the parents. But then when they answered the assessment honestly, they were struggling a lot more than even their parents knew. It's a terrible situation because the parents can't support the children in the way they need to be supported. But of course they can't, because the parents are grieving the loss of a child. So there's no easy solution. But I think it was very important to me to kind of validate the people reading the book who may have experienced a loss as a child and have spent all of those years feeling unseen.
Yeah, and talking to some of those adults who lost their sibling much earlier on, who are like, oh, and then 20 years later, I have to go through all the grief that I masked to keep that balance, or to not tip my parents' boat over that was like threatening to capsize.
Yeah. What I think about when I'm parenting is this piece of helping expand her capacity to understand that it's okay to be upset, or like that I can hold that. We had a dog we had to rehome, and we loved her, but she had food aggression and she was dangerous. So we're like, she can't be in a home with children. And my daughter was 4 at the time. And we went, and she seemed fine. It was just like, let's go help her find a home that could be with just adults and say all the lovely things about her. But as soon as they took her, she collapsed. And we just sat outside and cried together. And she's like, I didn't know it was going to be this hard. And I just kept saying, yeah, it's so hard, and we loved her. And there's nothing normal about having to say goodbye to someone you love. It hurts. So I think about the bigger context of, she knows I can hold her grief. And that feels really important. And you offered this song, you said, Unconditional I, Look Out Kid. I was like, I need to go look up that song. And I started listening to it. I was like, I need to sing her this song. And I mean, I barely can say the lines without breaking every time, and if you feel it, it's fine. I give you everything that's mine. It's like such sweetness. And I think we have to start early reminding children that your feelings are valid and we can hold your feelings. And I think that's another sort of cultural phenomenon we can do a whole show on, and we will. But I was like, that's part of it is saying, I'm the grown up. I can handle you breaking apart. And so sure, there are going to be moments where I'm really breaking apart. But if she knows in her bones, I trust that some grown up can handle this, she might reach out for support. Yeah.
I listened to that song, obviously, a lot during the writing of the book. And it got to the point where my kids would be like, please don't put on this song again. So I, kind of got past it, or was listening to it just on my own. I acknowledged that they didn't need to hear it all the time. And after about a year, my 6-year-old, who was 4 or 5 at the time, but started requesting it. And now she requests it in the car all the time because she loves singing along to it. It's very cathartic. And I think it's very comforting. And she'll be like, Mom, I want to make a request and I think you're going to like it. I'm like, okay, what is it? And she says, Unconditional. And I'm like, all right, let's do it. And singing along to it really is so cathartic.
Well, it has so many beautiful messages, like you can trust your body, you can dance and shake. I mean, there's so many.
You'll make a mistake, you'll lose your friends again and again. Nothing's ever perfect.
So sweet. So yeah, thank you for that gift.
Oh, I'm so glad.
Yes, I also did a lot of Spotify, because I didn't know many of them. So I loved that. For listeners, at the start of each chapter, Annie includes a lyric from a song. Her brother loved music, and you two shared that. And so I really loved that integration. It's so interesting because we've had another author who we really, really love, Warren, who talked a lot about music and putting together playlists and just the power of music to do that. And we did another one of Grief on the Screen where we talked about the show Shrinking, where it's a dad and a teenage daughter and the mom passes away, and she puts together like this raging grief soundtrack. And I have one that I know like this is going to make me cry, and I'm going to listen to it, and it's going to just get all my feels out because they need to come out. And so I just love this connection of the power of music and its ability to move those feelings through our bodies and connect us. So I loved that too.
It's funny. I was talking to someone on a different podcast, and he had that with movies.
Oh, sure. Oh, yeah.
And like specific episodes of TV shows. And he talked about like sometimes when I know I need to cry and I need to get it out, I'll put on this specific episode of this thing.
Yep.
And it's so true. And then it helps you kind of just get to that place you need to be at.
Yeah. Sometimes you just need a little help. Yeah. I also have episodes. They're kind of random. Like the very last episodes of Scrubs before they did that reboot make me cry every single time. Atreyu in Never Ending Story. Right?
Okay.
See?
Yeah.
Rebecca and I have talked about it before.
With Atreyu.
E.T. E.T. gets us saddest movie we've ever seen. Another thing that we kind of touched on this at the beginning of how you really, really intentionally and thoughtfully included this spectrum of relationships, spectrum of deaths. And one thing that you cover quite a bit, I'd say, is deaths by suicide. So it's impacted by mental health, and deaths also arguably by mental health because of addiction. And in that same chapter, although I feel like you talk about this so many times through the book, it's this idea of not just remembering the end. I think just like in our conversation of should I have called more, or oh, was I nice in that last conversation, or oh, I didn't take that one last walk with my dad, or whatever it was. I think when there are those sudden losses, including like a really tragic one, like your brother's or murder or something where you think so much about the final moments, and you really encourage mourners, siblings to think about the fullness of the whole relationship and the whole life. And I had read this quote. There was this interview by one of my favorite drummers who passed away, and he had had an overdose in his 20s and he had nearly died. He was in a coma for like a week or something. And our culture wanted to ask him about that overdose all the time. And he was like, I don't want my life defined by this one thing. I'm so many things. And that's one of the things that I've been in my life as an addict. But it's not the entirety. And I think sometimes having had a family member recently pass away who had severe addiction issues, I think sometimes that can become the narrative that we replay. And I loved your encouragement to think about all of it.
I found, especially with addiction and mental health issues, that the siblings I spoke to would give so many qualifiers. And I really felt like they were so quick to diminish their own grief and their own loss. And I wanted to kind of pull them out and say, it sounds like that was really hard. Yes, my brother died very tragically and very suddenly. But the flip side of that is that I didn't ever watch him suffer. I didn't watch him suffer with addiction. I didn't watch him suffer from mental illness. And I can't imagine how difficult that would be. And so people would say things like, well, I kind of saw it coming because there's addiction.
Right.
And my knee-jerk reaction to that is, well, that's fucking terrible.
Right.
You saw it coming? How scary must that be?
Yeah.
You're thinking every phone call is that phone call, and you're watching them struggle with that thing. That doesn't strike me as easier.
Right.
But the qualifiers, as if it doesn't matter as much. And that always broke my heart.
Yeah.
In another interview, a sibling whose brother had died by suicide when he was 14. And she talks about, she imagines what he would be like now because no one is their best self at 14. And so she was like, it just seems cruel to immortalize someone at 14. No one is their best at 14. And no one wants to be remembered always as a 14-year-old. And so she talked about imagining what he'd be like now and kind of like extrapolating who he was into the future because she didn't want to just focus on that. and that who he was at the end. And I thought that was really beautiful too.
That was, and I think it ties into later in the book where you're talking about having an ongoing relationship with your sibling, creating that version of them for yourself so that you do get to be in relationship, so that you can imagine them beyond that moment, beyond that age, beyond that affliction or that addiction. I thought that was also a beautiful gift to offer people. If you can explore a relationship with your lost sibling, even though they're not physically with you anymore. And it doesn't mean you're like, oh, now my birthdays are really fun because they're here in my imagination, you know?
Right. But I loved actually the way that you framed the memory as time travel. I mean, there's memory that we time travel to the past and have memory, but we also create memories of the future. And this way that it feels like that weaves in that you're sort of, what's the relationship that you want to imagine having and using the capacity of memory in that way.
Yeah, you can use the memory to kind of fuel your imagination and what it would be like now.
Yeah, I thought that was really beautiful.
I did not realize Catcher in the Rye is a grief story. And I mean,
oh my gosh.
I read this book. I have opinions about this book. What a miss that my language arts teacher didn't point out that this was a grief story. I mean, it's wild. I'm like, really? I have to go back and read it.
Same.
I didn't know this.
I highly recommend a reread. It will enrage you. Talk about a book with a lot of tabs in it. My copy of Catcher in the Rye is like, I wanted to scream at the book. Like, why is no one helping this child?
Oh.
He is 16 years old. His brother died at 13. And as soon as his brother died, his parents shipped him off to boarding school.
Right.
And he has consistently gotten himself kicked out of every boarding school since because all he wants to do is go back home.
Mm-hmm.
And he sneaks into his apartment just to see his sister. Oh my God. I mean, the kid is screaming for help.
Yeah.
Everyone is just like, oh, what an asshole kid. This kid's acting up. He's got real problems. It's like, yeah, his problem is he's grieving.
Yes.
Kid needs a hug.
Kid needs
That's what he needs.
A hug and a good
I
cry.
was like, I just want to hug Holden.
Oh, same. I had the same reaction. I was like, wait, what? Did I read that book? That was my thought. It's like, did I read that book? I mean, obviously I had to.
Yeah, I'm going to go back and reread it for sure.
Just brace yourself.
I know.
I think one of my favorite sort of sub-chapter headings is giving the finger to everyone. But you really cover the anger that siblings are holding all over, including at the deceased sometimes, at their family, in places where there was a killer, at society. And you really just put it all out there and allow people to sort of have a place to land. And so I just want to talk to you a little bit about what you heard and the different ways that people were holding that anger and then the way that you sort of closed it up for us with Marie Kondo, that anger.
Yeah, I think one of the interesting things about anger is that it's so acute and so strong. And it was, in many cases, it was so unexpected. People really did not see it coming. And when you don't see it coming, it's really scary.
Yeah.
I talk about a story, in the book of when I felt this kind of uncontrollable anger. And again, I'm in my mid-20s, a chronic people pleaser, nice girl.
Yeah.
And I found it terrifying. I felt like I was completely out of control and I couldn't trust myself. I couldn't trust my body. I couldn't trust my mind. And I heard that a lot. And the anger at the deceased, which then obviously you feel guilty about when it kind of subsides, or maybe you feel guilty about it kind of in the moment, but like, how dare you? Like, how could you leave me here with these people and not be here with me? It's very easy to lash out and feel that anger. And I think it becomes especially strong when your grief is being diminished. It's very easy then, if everything is being diminished, it's easy for that anger to flourish. There are a lot more people to be angry at. Everyone who says, how are your parents doing, but doesn't ask you how you're doing.
Yeah.
That's a great outlet for your anger. And so it just is very overwhelming. And there's, I think a lot of it is just kind of the unfairness of it all. Like siblings are supposed to be our longest relationship. Now it's not.
Yeah.
and now they're gone. And just that is enough to be really angry about. And it's hard to know what to do with that anger.
Yeah.
A lot of people who were angry at the deceased were like, I don't even know how to be angry at a dead person, but I'm angry at this dead person, right? Like they can't fight back. They can't do anything, but I'm so mad at you. And it's so, it's not satisfying at all.
Right.
Because how do you get to a resolution?
Yeah.
You have to let it go, but you don't get to have that fight that's going to feel good. And you don't get to have that reconciliation that feels good. You have to go through all of that on your own. And it's not an easy thing to do. It's kind of the only way because no one else is going to make it better for you.
Yeah.
And so that kind of Marie Kondoing the anger is that acknowledgement of, I feel this anger. I have a lot of anger, but it's not serving me.
Yeah.
It's not helping me. It's not helping me move any closer to acceptance or to, a place where I can really handle it. And it's not something that you kind of magically let go of and it doesn't come back. But I do think it's kind of like clutter where you it builds up and then you have a really good purge and then you buy some more tchotchkes and the anger is going to come back to some degree, and then you purge again. None of this is kind of fixed once.
Yeah.
It's kind of an ongoing thing.
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
And speaking of acceptance, I really appreciated, I think sometimes language is so tricky and people hear things even within grief communities that mean to support, like they'll say grief and awakening or gratitude or something where you're like, I can't even wrap my heart around that word because I have grief, I'm angry, I'm sad, that I don't want to think about gratitude. And so acceptance can have that feeling, and you named it so well. And the part where the therapist that you were interviewing said, it's not saying that it's okay. It's just acknowledging this is the reality. Mm-hmm. And that distinction felt so important because I think that acceptance does have a feel as a word that it means it's okay. And that's not what you're saying.
Right. And that was really what I got stuck on. I thought of acceptance like a college acceptance, right? Where it's like a positive thing and you wanted the thing and then you were accepted into the thing and it's a mutual agreement and everything is roses and rainbows. But what she explained, it totally comes down to language. But she said, no, it's reality acceptance. It's not just acceptance. Right. It's reality acceptance. Mm-hmm. And I was like, oh. It's that moment of they're actually gone. Right. This thing actually happened, and letting go of the maybe he's coming back. Mm-hmm. I certainly held on to that of what if he's actually a prisoner of war and he's alive somewhere and we don't know because we weren't allowed to open the coffin and we don't even know what's in there. Maybe it was an empty box and he's alive somewhere in the hills of Afghanistan being held by the Taliban. Mm-hmm. Right. And reality acceptance is saying, no, that's not what happened. Mm-hmm. There were witnesses. He was with a group of people. This is the thing that happened. And you don't have to like it, right? Mm-hmm. But you have to acknowledge that it is the reality of what happened. Yeah. And her simple reframe and calling it reality acceptance instead of just acceptance, it really reframed it for me.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I think it's so important too within the context of a sibling death where it's kind of like Megan Devine would describe the out of order death when it's so young and not in the order of things like a grandparent or parents as they're aging, and that feeling of this is what happened and it shouldn't have happened. Yeah. Mm-hmm. And that we can hold both.
Yeah. And that we can hold both of those, and just the reality acceptance of we rarely like everything that's happening in a real moment in the real world. And yet we need to face that this is the reality that we're living in, even though I imagine there's just such a desire for it not to be real and to hold on to that possibility as unbelievable as it might be. Mm-hmm. So I'm so glad that she offered you that.
Me too.
Well, I cannot believe this, but we are at time and I'm literally not even through my dog-eared pages of things that I wanted to talk to you about. I will offer this reflection to anyone who is listening. This book is for you if you lost a sibling. It's also for you if you're the parent of someone who has lost a sibling. It's for you if you're a friend of someone who has lost a sibling. I mean, I learned so much about sibling loss and the ways that it's so similar to my own losses and the ways that it's totally different. And I'm so grateful that you wrote this for siblings who now are not forgotten and they are very remembered. And they will see themselves and find a place for themselves in this, but it's also for so many other people. So I hope if you know someone who has lost a sibling, that you will pick this up. And I'll also just offer quickly that at the end, especially if you're sort of in any moment of acute grief, the end has these exercises that you give folks. They're just like a workbook that you could sort of take out and use and move through. So even if you're in that space where absorbing narrative and information more than just like an article long is difficult, you can turn to the exercises. So I just wanted to offer that because I think this book is for so many more people than just siblings, although that is a very important demographic for this book. And I'm so glad that you wrote it, Annie.
Thank you. Thank you so much. And I agree. I hope it's for everyone who lives around or surrounds a sibling, not just the sibling, but the parents and the friends. And, I hope people will see themselves reflected in the pages and their stories and experiences reflected.
I think so. All right. So we close out by asking one another how we've been checking in with our grief this week. So Annie, do you mind if we start with you?
So one way I'm checking in with my grief, since the book has come out, I have found myself writing less because I don't have a deadline and accountability and people looking for me. I really, really missed it. And I journal a lot, but not as much this summer. And I have felt that absence. And I think a lot of times acknowledging and working through my grief happens on those pages. And I think that's a big part of why I was kind of feeling the absence. And so this week, I got back to doing my mourning pages and kind of checking in with myself and my grief. And sometimes I kind of talk to Ben on those pages. And so it's been really nice to get back to that and hopefully kind of stick with it a bit, even though no one is waiting for any pages.
Beautiful, beautiful. Rebecca, how are you touching into your grief this week?
I'm currently running, I do these book gatherings around different grief books, and we're doing one on Marissa Renee Lee's Grief is Love.
It's a beautiful book.
Such a beautiful book. Yeah.
I love that book.
I know. So, that always presences me to grief. So I had this group last night, and we talked about it a little bit today, even in this interview, but this thought of capacity. And in conversation, what came up was something around how when you experience the first grief and you kind of go into overwhelm and you don't know, it's like, I don't know that I have the capacity to do this. That's one of the things that you learn over time is that you actually do have the capacity, and that whatever that is, that bubble or that box gets bigger because you're like, I've been here before. I trust myself that I can, it'll never feel good to be in grief, but I can sort of trust myself to let myself feel. And when Marissa Renee Lee talks about it in terms of when she went through her miscarriage, kind of knowing I've done the grief of my mom. So now I know what I need so fast in a way that I didn't before. So I've just been thinking about that, this way that we can't, I think any of us who've been through grief and traumatic loss, and that we kind of can get in that place of, I don't want it to happen again. And now I have this awareness that this is life and I don't get to avoid it, to just remember this continuous capacity growing that we have as we learn to integrate our losses. So yeah, just being with that. What about you, Andrea?
It's a turn of the season as we record this. And so we're heading into fall, and fall always feels like a sort of reflective reset kind of time, just everything kind of slows down. And so I've actually put together just this kind of permanent altar in our living room for our ancestors, and just to kind of sit and remember them. And every day I go and I light an incense and say my prayers to them and remember them, and sort of in this time when I feel really alone, remembering in my belief system, they surround me and are supporting me. And it's been really tender looking at pictures and family members that have passed that I forgot about, that passed when I was really young, or ones that I only remember usually on Dia de Muertos when we put our altar and ofrenda together. And I've felt like I'm always a highly sensitive person, but I've felt a lot of just teariness over the last few weeks at everything. And so I'm just kind of embracing, just like my heart is really soft and tender right now. And that's just where I am. So I'm so glad to share that little tender heart with both of you. Annie, we're so grateful for you coming on and chatting with us and for you to have written this book. Wonderful. Best of luck move. I hope it is so seamless as you trek those boxes across 2 lawns.
No, exactly. One of my neighbors was joking that everyone should just stand out in a line,
Right.
and we can just like assembly line pass the boxes down. This is obviously why I need to stay in my neighborhood, because I have neighbors at the bus stop who make suggestions like that.
I love
it.
But yes, thank you. I'm very excited.
Well, thank you again, and we wish you all the best luck. All right. Both of you. Love you both. Have a great day.
Thank you. Have a great weekend.
Yes.
Thank you for listening to this episode of All the Grief. You can find us on Instagram at allthegriefpod. And please take a moment to rate our podcast and share us with your friends. We'd love to keep expanding our reach to all the people who could benefit from conversations on grief. Take care.